Hello, this is Mike Borislow, Executive Director of Massachusetts Youth Soccer Association. And this pre-recorded webinar is to review the latest update to the reopening of Massachusetts Phase 3, Step 1 for youth sports. This is all based on the August 13th amendment that came out. Now, before I start, I want to use a little bit of a story to kind of explain what's taking place. The best way I could think about this was growing up with three brothers. We used to play tag in the backyard. And every time my older brother was it, he changed the rules. My other brothers and I would play along, and then ever he was it, he would change the rules again. It really kind of upset us, but we still played, we had fun, and the game usually ended with laughs. Well, that's what we're dealing with right now, is that the state of Massachusetts is reacting to what's taking place. And because of this, they're modifying the rules. They're modifying the way we can go about playing games and the way we can go about doing certain other things. So we have to make the most of it. We have to accept it, and we have to learn to accept and have fun. And I believe that when this is all said and done, our children will have fun. So, normal. What is normal? As you can see from this little graphic here, we have been dealing with a lot of change. We've had to modify the way we live our lives on a daily basis. Some of us have had to quarantine. Some of us have had to make dramatically different arrangements for daycare. Quite a few of us are essential workers, whether it's in food service or in the healthcare. We've had to change the way we go to work and how we deal with the daily challenges that we have because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Schooling is totally different. So when people have talked about the modifications that we're making to the game of soccer so that our children can still play the game of soccer, it's the same way we've had to modify going out in public to stores, to restaurants, or for family gatherings. We've had to modify. Now, I can tell you this, and I really believe it. If you were to ask any child about playing with modifications or not playing at all, the decision is easy. They would choose the modifications. So I guess we can call this a season of modifications, or the no contact season, or any other name that you want to come up with. But I believe our children, when it's all said and done, will tell us, yes, it was different, but they did have fun. This is the season for us to focus on skills development, focus on technique, focus on team camaraderie, focus on the joy of the game, not on scores and standings. So the reopening of Massachusetts has been an ever-evolving process as we attempt to stop the spread of COVID. We want to keep our children safe. I've shared this slide the last two presentations I made, and it has not changed. The two driving factors behind the decisions being made are the numbers. And Massachusetts has some of the best numbers in the country. It's the positive test rate to the number of tests being taken has been as low as 1.2, 1.4. And the other key factor is to mitigate the chance of respiratory particle transmission. The EEA, the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, provides us with our releases. This department has been overseeing youth and adult sports, youth and adult amateur sports. They have authority over the workplace safety and reopening standards for businesses and other entities providing youth and adult amateur sport activities. They make recommendations that go up to the reopening committee. And the reopening committee gets input from the Department of Public Health and Health and Human Services prior to anything being made public. With the input from the DPH and HHS, it's then given along to the reopening committee overseen by the Lieutenant Governor. And this is how we receive the information as it pertains to youth soccer. So lately in the last release, they put limitations on recreational activities. The limitations have to do with the ability to participate in a sport is determined by the risk of transmission of COVID-19, the level of risk associated with the type of play without modifications to play, and then whether a sport can modify play to reduce risk. The limitations on recreational activities take a look at whether organizations, businesses, schools, government entities can operate their premises and facilities for use by adults in youth sport, phase 3, step 1, provided safety measures that are outlined in their guidelines are implemented. So let's take a look at what the state is saying we must implement. First, we have to revisit the risk categories. If you compared the latest release to the prior, there were some minor changes. Soccer is classified as a moderate risk sport. And these are sports or activities that involve intermittent close proximity or limited incidental physical contact between participants. So as a moderate risk sport, we have certain levels of play that are available to us. Level 1, which is individual or socially distanced group activities, which is what we were able to participate in during phase 2. And then when phase 3, step 1 started, we were reclassified as a moderate risk sport soon after the classifications came out, and we're able to participate in levels 1, 2, and 3. At this point, all moderate and high-risk sports are unable to participate in level 4 tournaments. So soccer, once again, is in phase 3, step 1. We are levels 1, 2, and 3. Effective August 17th, based on a August 13th release, moderate risk sports can participate in level 1 as traditionally played, which is the phase 2 methodology. And then levels 2 and 3 play are only allowed if the minimum mandatory standards for modifications to play are met. So play must be modified in order for us to play level 2 in town inter-club scrimmages and level 3 league play. So let's take a look at what the minimum mandatory modifications are. All facility operators and activity organizers. Activity organizers are everybody that runs a soccer program. Town programs, clubs, and leagues are all activity organizers. Facility operators are self-explanatory. That's anybody that's in the system that also operates their own facility and or operates a facility on behalf of somebody else. So all facility operators and activity organizers of moderate and higher risk sports must develop and implement sport-specific modifications to play to minimize the risk of transmission of infection among participants. And I will stress the word must develop. So to modify play, some of the things that we must consider. We have to take into place measures to implement to significantly limit contact and increase physical distancing. So we can modify play as much as possible to keep players spaced 6 feet apart for a majority of the game or practice. We could also shorten activities, practices, and gameplay, or play with fewer numbers, and use protective equipment in a safe manner to further reduce the spread of respiratory particles. These are must-dos according to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the minimum standards for modifications must be met in order for moderate and higher risk sports to engage in levels 2 or 3 play. We must modify play to limit contact or increase distancing for participants, which include eliminating deliberate contact and minimizing intermittent contact. Sports that cannot modify play, as outlined, cannot engage in level 3 play, but may be able to participate in level 2 if they can incorporate other modifications. This would be sports such as rugby or possibly other contact sports such as wrestling, that in order for those sports to be played, collision, physical contact can't be eliminated. So they can go to level 2 with other modifications if they would like. Since soccer can modify play, this section of the EEA guidelines does not apply. So what we did was we focused on the 2 requirements imposed by the EEA to eliminate deliberate contact and minimize intermittent contact. We worked on identifying those situations during a game or practice that would require modifications to meet this requirement. And this is the list we came up with. We also conferred with other states who are going through similar modification requirements, as well as several states that aren't able to play at all, and they're taking a look at how can they modify play. So we kind of worked our way around the body of the player first, which was heading. We know that heading can cause quite a bit of contact. So could we minimize this intermittent contact? We took a look at permissible body contact, which in soccer, the only permissible body contact is shoulder-to-shoulder contact on a challenge. Took a look at slide tackling, and then the frequent and high probability of player contact and closeness during throw-ins, corner kicks, and restarts, indirect and direct free kicks, and drop balls. Let's take a look at each one individually. Heading. By now, you have all read the modifications. I know the reactions have been different from many people. Yet, we feel, based on the input that we have received, that given the modifications we're going through, that these will meet the state requirements and allow our children to enjoy this beautiful game.
So with heading, all intentional heading of a soccer ball is suspended for all ages. Any intentional heading will be treated as playing in a dangerous manner with an indirect free kick restart. For those of us that have had children at U12 and lower playing without heading, this is nothing new. This is basically taking the ban on heading for U12 and lower to all ages. Shoulder-to-shoulder contact. Shoulder-to-shoulder contact is suspended, or any other additional physical contact is to be considered a violation of Law 12, playing in dangerous manner, indirect free kick, or other applicable foul or misconduct. So if it's a straight shoulder-to-shoulder contact that a referee would typically let go, that is now suspended and cannot be done. Any other contact that's not clean shoulder-to-shoulder is either a foul or a misconduct. Pushing, shoving, pulling, and the such. And those fouls, of course, will always be called, and the particular restart for that foul or misconduct will be used. Slide tackling. Slide tackling whenever within 6 feet of another player is suspended. And again, it's going to be treated just like we went over shoulder to shoulder. Why within 6 feet? The reason why we chose 6 feet, first off, that it is the distancing that the state has been using, the CDC has been using, so we stuck with 6 feet. And we felt if a slide tackle is attempted within 6 feet, we could have a collision, we could have the taking out of a player at the ankles or the feet, there could be contact. Even if the player gets all ball, the other player could fall on them. And so this is just another way for us to reduce intermittent contact. A player is still permitted to go to the ground or slide tackle to block a ball or to save it from going out of touch as long as they're outside of 6 feet. Throw-ins. Throw-ins are also suspended to be replaced by a kick-in. Now listed below are the modifications for the procedure for a kick-in. Everything else is as it would apply to a throw-in, and I'll pick out one example in a second. The player taking the kick-in must be facing the field of play and need to keep both feet on the ground during the kick-in. Of course, this is a modification because on a throw-in, you have to have both feet on the ground. Must put part of the ball on the touchline or on the ground outside the touchline. Once again, this is similar to a player's feet during a throw-in. This is the important one. The ball may not be kicked directly into the opponent's penalty area or across the penalty area and into the goal. This is so that we can reduce players jostling and pushing and nudging and whatever it takes to get a good position. We're trying to reduce intermittent contact. All opponents must stand at least 10 yards away or 8 yards for small-sided from the point where the kick-in is taking place. So very much this is like an indirect free kick, except the ball may not go directly into the opponent's penalty area. And any other offenses to a kick-in are just as similar to a throw-in. For example, deliberately kicking the ball at an opponent. Corner kicks, very similar to kick-ins. Corner kicks are suspended and will be replaced by a corner kick-in. Modifications are the ball may not be kicked directly into the opponent's penalty area. Again, following the mandate from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to eliminate contact and to reduce intermittent contact. We're making sure that the ball doesn't go into the penalty area where players will be fighting for position, being too close to each other with contact. Again, opponents must remain at least 10 yards or 8 yards away from the corner arc, which is not a modification to a regular corner kick. Just emphasizing that it's going to be, again, like an indirect free kick from the corner. If the ball does go into the penalty area on a corner kick in or on a kick in, that will be treated as an improper kick, and the ball will be given to the opponent at the place of the kick in or corner kick in. Once again, the same type of offenses and sanctions for corner kicks will apply to corner kick-ins. For all restarts, all players must comply with the 6-foot distancing from both teammates and opponents. Indirect free kicks and free kicks that are taken anywhere on the field, everybody must separate as much as possible to 6 feet from each other. And as with all indirect free kicks and free kicks, the opponent must remain 10 yards from the ball prior to the kick. What this effectively does is that it currently suspends the use of a traditional defensive wall. Once again, following the state's mandate of eliminating contact, intentional contact, and reducing intermittent contact by taking away the wall, this helps with that requirement. The referee will, of course, control the restart. If a team asks for distance, such as obeying the 10 yards, the referee will point to the whistle and hold the ceremonial restart, and the referee will make sure that the opponents are 10 yards away and, as much as possible, have the other remaining players on the field be 6 feet from each other. When the restart takes place, it's free play, that the 6-foot distancing no longer is in place. Players can play closer than 6 feet to each other. They just have to abide by the other modifications that are in place, which once again is the no heading, no shoulder to shoulder, and no slide tackling. And lastly, the use of a drop ball as a restart is suspended. To replace this procedure, an indirect free kick will be awarded to the team whom the referee deemed to be in possession when the referee stops play. This is very similar to the rule that high school had for many years. The modifications that we just went through apply to all soccer activities, practices, and games. Now, you have to keep in mind that these are modifications that Mass Youth Soccer is making to the laws of the game during this time of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and as long as the state says we need to do so. However, these modifications may be made stricter. A local board of health may place further modifications on play, whether it's to the laws of the game or playing with PPE. They have the final say-so at the local level. And it's very possible we may have some member organizations, whether it's a town program, a club, or a league, place further modifications in order to help us with the state mandate of modifying to eliminate contact and reduce intermittent contact, eliminating intentional contact. The definition of a competition was slightly modified with this latest version that came out. Now, competition is defined as two teams competing against one another in a single contest. Scrimmages, friendlies, inter-team games, which is league games. Those are defined as competitions. Teams are limited to competing against a single opposing team per day. Now, this is the change that was recently made. Actually, this came out after the 13th version came out, or August 13th version. A team may play multiple competitions against the same team in a single day. However, there may be no competitions with additional teams. So you could actually have a double header against another team. You just can't introduce a third team into the equation. You can't do a mini round robin. So you can play against the same team once or twice in a day, but not round robin style with 3 teams. The next area that we're going to cover and have been receiving quite a few questions on has to do with capacity limits. Before I start going into some of the details here, what's important to note is that prior to the August 13th revision coming out, that there was also a notification. It was the order number 46 came out on the Friday prior, which limited gatherings for many people across the state. However, there was some confusion because people were starting to believe that the 100 limit was going down to 50 for our soccer games. And that was not the case. Because youth sports falls under the guidance from sector-specific guidance from the EEA, that order number 46 did not apply to youth sports. We were just about to send out a clarification when this new version came out on August 13th. So based on what came out on the 13th, I'll review what the capacity limits are for practices and games. For practices, no more than 25 players or participants, part of the typo, for example, coaches, can be on a single playing surface at any one time. A single playing surface for us is a field. So for a practice, you can have up to 25 players and coaches on one field. I will go into some examples later on. Now, if a facility has multiple fields, they may be used by more than one group of 25 at any one time. So if a facility has 2 full-sized 11v11 fields next to each other, you could have 25 on one field and 25 on the other field. If you have 2 small-sided fields next to each other inside a large field, a full-size field, each of those small-sized fields could have 25 on each for a practice. Fields must be spaced at least 14 feet apart when sharing a single field. It previously was 20, at which that's what we would like to keep it at, but the state did reduce it to 14. Primary reason was a lot of indoor facilities with basketball courts. That was the most common space of separation. Mass Youth Soccer is putting into place a new limit. During the current COVID-19 pandemic state of emergency as proclaimed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Mass Youth Soccer requires all member organizations to limit the number of spectators at all sanctioned soccer activities to 1 per player. The spectators are defined as a parent, a legal guardian, or a chaperone. This is actually the rules that are in place from the Commonwealth for indoor sports. And we have decided to put this in place so that we really will never have a problem running over the limit that we have in place now for outdoor sports. So for an outdoor competition, there are two little numbers we need to take a look at. The first is that no more than 25 players on any surface or playing area for team and group sports. That's the wording from the state. So for an 11v11 game, that's 22 players. Never going to have a problem hitting the 25. And then as we even move down further, we're way below the 25 player limit for games, 9v9, 7v7, 4v4, because that's per field, not per venue, not per complex, not per site, but per field. And for the purposes of the above bullet number 1, players are defined as any person on the official team roster and actively involved in play as defined by IFAB. There may be a little bit of an error in the use of these terms, but basically it's a player on the field of play. IFAB defines the player on the field as a player and a player off the field as a sub. So you can have up to 25 players on a field during a game at any one time. Now let's talk about off the field. No more than 50 people, excluding players, which are the substitutes, coaches, referees, or facility activity workers in the aggregate in, on, or surrounding any playing surface or field, provided there's adequate space for everybody to maintain at least 6 feet of social distancing. So if you've got a roster, and I'll have an example coming up later, but let's say, make it real simple. You have a roster of 20, and it's an 11v11 game. You've got 11 players on the field, and you have 9 players off the field. So those 9 players, and let's say it's both teams have the exact same number. So you've got 9 subs for one, 9 subs for another, 11 on the field. You've got 2 coaches each and 3 referees and 2 facility workers. They don't count towards the 50 people. Once again, those players that are substitutes must be on the official team roster. Any player that's not on the official team roster that is sitting on the sideline is considered a spectator. And quite frankly, they should not be with roster players. This all has to do with tracing so that we can maintain control of who we have in these environments. Now, for facilities with multiple fields, the capacity limitations shall apply per playing field, provided there's adequate space for at least 6 feet social distancing. So if you have a complex that has 3 large-sized fields, and you're playing 3 11v11 games, each one will have its own capacity limits. It's not in the aggregate. Now, keep in mind, Mass Youth Soccer further reduces the numbers of people that can be at an event because it's a limit of 1 spectator per player. Activity organizers should set their schedules so there's a 20-minute buffer to prevent the overlap of participations from one leaving and the others coming, and cross-contamination and cleanup time. For facilities with multiple fields, or really any facility for that matter, the organizers should mark off designated areas for spectators for each field to minimize the overlap from adjacent fields. We're going to move into a section of field configurations that we provided in our guidelines released on Saturday. Now, in order to maintain lower numbers on soccer fields and surrounding areas for the spectators, the following configurations must be adhered to. We're going to be using either the actual lined area of a full-size 11x11 soccer field, which could be 100 by 50 or 110 by 60 or 115 by 65 or 75. And so we're going to take a look at that space, okay? And they must be limited to the following configurations for practice or games. The first configuration is the easiest. One full-size field to be used according to the 25 player or participant limit. So for practices, it's limited to 25 player and participants. And for games, it's players only because the referees are excluded from the number, and up to 25 on the field for a game, of which for 11x11, it's 22, not a problem. Why the number 25? Because there are some other sports that will have more than 11x11 on there. And remember, the guidelines the state came out with apply to all sports, not just soccer. The second type of configuration is that you could have two small-sided 9x9s or two development-size 7x7s within a full-sized field. Let's look at the two 9x9s, the blue ones at the top. They should be 20 feet apart, even though 14 is the minimum, but we suggest 20 feet between the two. And you could have two games taking place, or two practices for that matter, and it's 25 on each field as a limit, and then the spectator capacity is per field. So if, let's say you had two teams of 20 each, that's a total of 40 players per field. Around each of those fields, you could have up to 40 spectators, one per player. And once again, the spectators does not include players, coaches, referees, and facility workers. Down below is the 7x7. Typically, a lot of facilities, and Mass Youth Soccer in Lancaster was one, we would put 4 7x7 fields in a full-sized field. In order to reduce the limits and to help keep below the numbers, we are now reducing the ability to have 4 fields, but just down to 2 per large field space. Now, we understand a lot of complexes out there may not have a full-size field lined, and they would have a series of 7x7 fields set up. The key is to take the overall space, identify what typically would be considered a full-sized field, which could be as small as 100 by 50, which is a football field. And then you could have 2 7x7s in that space. So if you have a setup where you have quite a few 7x7s tightly combined, you may have to reduce the number of fields being used. And lastly is the micro 4x4 size fields, and similar to 7x7, the maximum number of micro fields you could put in the area of a typical full-size field is 4. And further, instead of 25 per surface, we are saying the maximum is 12 player participants per surface. So if it's a practice, you could have up to 12 per surface, including the coach. And if it's a game, it's going to be 8 players because it's 4v4. And once again, each of these 4 micro surfaces has a limit of spectators to 1 per player. So let's take a look at some examples that I talked about. The 11v11 field, 25 players and participants, the coaches are permitted on the field, no problem. Limit of 1 spectator per player. Most of the time for practices, the limit won't be an issue, as some parents will wait in the car. Some parents will make a trip out to Dunkin' Donuts and come back. So the limits will never be an issue for the 50, as long as everybody is 6 feet apart and wearing their face mask at all times as spectators. Or you could have your 2 9v9 small size fields or a 7v7 development size field laid out on a full sized. And once again, those are treated separately. So you could have 25 players and participants for practices on each separate surface. And once again, you're limited to 1 spectator per player for each of those playing surfaces. Let's take a look at a game example. I've been using this already. So you have an 11v11 game, 20 rostered players per team. So you have 11 on the field, 9 on the sideline, 2 coaches, 3 referees. So your spectator limit is 1 per player. Now, if rosters have more than a total of 50 players, so let's say you have 2 rosters and you have one team has 25 and one team has 26. So you have a max of 50 per playing surface as mandated by the state. First off, for the rosters to be that big, it's unlikely but possible. The other part is, well, one of the coaches could be the parent of a child. So the coach is not counted in the 50, so you'll be below the 50. It's rare, but it may happen. How about a game example for 9v9 or 7v7? That the following applies per playing field, not the 2 combined if laid out on a 1 full-size field. So you have 20 rostered players per team, 11 on the field, 9 on the sideline, 2 coaches, 3 referees, the same exact. Okay, it's a max of 50 per field. Most likely you're not going to have 20 players rostered on a 9v9. It's going to be much smaller. So with us having to worry about hitting the 50-person max is not an issue, not going to be a challenge. This is a change that we are making due to some confusion and some concerns prior to this. Prior to this, we kind of restricted everybody to the field that they typically play on, and that's being lifted. So all age or grade groups may practice or play on any sized surface, except mini fields, which are for use of 8U and 2nd grade or younger. So if you split a field into 2 9v9s for practice, you could have 2 U14 or U15 or grade 10 or whatever grouping you use, playing or practicing on those 2 9v9s next to each other. That's permissible, absolutely. Or if you have 2 7v7s set up and you want to have 2 teams practicing on them that typically play 9v9 or 11v11, that's permissible. One of the other reasons for us making this modification is that there may be a lot of programs that decide to play 7v7 for their grade 7 and 8, or maybe even high school age this fall. And so you could have 2 7v7 games taking place on 2 separate pitches, properly spaced apart within a full-sized field. And so the only limitation we have is that we keep the mini fields for the 8U and second grade and younger. And once again, all capacity limit requirements per field must be adhered to. Let's move on to facial coverings. This is probably one of the key topics, in addition to the gathering sizes, that I have been getting most questions about. What I will be sharing with you is virtually identical to what the EEA, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, has shared with us with regards to the guidelines. We have made the decision that if we were to try and edit these, alter them, reword, paraphrase, that we would run afoul of pretty much misinterpreting and or misrepresenting what the state intended. So we are going to review exactly what the state has shared with us. I'll start with the end of what the state shared with us, which was an example. And they chose soccer. Aren't we lucky? So, at the end of the facial covering description and guideline, they use, for example, soccer players should have facial coverings with them at all times. And where possible, play with the facial covering on, removing it for long runs down the field, for plays without close contact, and in the goal. So right off the bat, the keeper does not need to keep the face mask on. But once again, soccer players should have facial coverings with them at all times, and where possible, play with the covering on. Now let's take a look at the beginning of the definition. This is directly from the state. While limiting proximity of participants is the first line of defense to reduce the risk of transmission, facility operators and activity orders must require facial coverings to be worn at all times by all participants except during high intensity aerobic and anaerobic activities, when distancing of 6 feet or more or possible between participants whenever feasible, or for individuals that are unable to wear a face covering due to a medical condition or disability. I think most of us would agree that for a large part of a soccer match, players are involved in high intensity aerobic or anaerobic activities. And then breathing can be difficult. And quite frankly, if a mask was to be kept on, it could be considered dangerous. Thus, the mask can be either removed and held by the player and or pulled down to the chin so they can breathe through the mouth, the nose, or just the nose during high intensity aerobic or anaerobic activity. And if they're more than 6 feet away from another player during play or during a stoppage, they can pull it down to catch their breath as well. And if players are not able to wear a face covering due to a medical condition or disability, it's just a matter of them providing their coach with the medical background, such as if they have asthma or some other respiratory ailment, to provide that proof from the doctor. And then the coach would then record that they are not able to wear a mask because of this exception. But then it goes on. Besides the exceptions, it states, otherwise, activity organizers must require facial coverings be worn while engaged in an activity wherever possible. Some sports, by their nature, involve intense aerobic activity throughout play. And as just previously stated, that masks do not need to be worn during periods of intense aerobic activity. So once again, what we're suggesting is players have a mask with them at all times and wear it as much as possible when not involved in aerobic or anaerobic activity, or when they're more than 6 feet away from other players. And we go on in the definition or the guideline. For these sports, the high-intensity aerobic sports, it's required that players use facial coverings when possible. Take frequent breaks when they are out of proximity to other players, using caution to avoid touching the front and inside of the face covering by using the ear loops to remove and replace. And then back to the example we used. So now we know that all players must have a face mask with them all times. There are exceptions for when they're involved in aerobic or anaerobic exercise, high intense exercise, when they're more than 6 feet away from others. And then the example that's provided by the state for us was soccer players should have facial coverings with them at all times. We're recommending that they do. And where possible, play with the covering on, removing it for long runs down the field, for plays without close contact and in the goal. And of course, during activities of high intense aerobic or anaerobic activity. And of course, participants for all sports, including soccer, must wear facial coverings while on the sidelines at all times if there's any team huddles or timeouts. And when the players are on the sidelines, they must be 6 feet apart with their facial covering on. So, excuse me, I'll just get back where I was. Thank you. Coaches, staff referees, umpires, and other officials are required to wear facial coverings and maintain a social distance of 6 feet from players, coaches, spectators, and other persons. And I just realized there's no comma between staff and referees. So it's coaches, staff, and referees and umpires. Must wear facial coverings at all times. Yes, we fully understand that for many referees in various sports, just not soccer, but other sports where the referee is covering a lot of ground, such as lacrosse, field hockey, and of course soccer, is that it can be very difficult for a referee to keep the mask on and not breathe heavy. We're working with some people at the state to try and see if we can get a little bit more leniency here, a little bit more clarification to this, and we hope to have an answer within the next week or two. But for now, the state feels very strongly that all adults have masks on 100% of the time. Every player is different in skill, build, health, and other factors. So how the Commonwealth's guidelines that I just reviewed are applied will not be the same for all based on these individual factors. Some players will be more easily winded than other players. It comes down to a multitude of factors that define one's fitness. So the key is to follow the guidelines as best possible, understanding that it's not a one-size-fits-all. And that we as coaches need to make sure that we understand our players' physicality, their fitness, and their health, and make sure that we guide them in the proper and correct use of a face covering while not making it dangerous for them to wear it. Now, there's been a misconception that if players wear masks 100% of the time while on the field, we can play without modifications. That's not true. First off, the guideline states that some activities may be permitted if face masks are worn, not the game in totality. The mandate is to eliminate intentional contact. So just by wearing a face mask doesn't permit you to go shoulder to shoulder. The mandate is to dramatically reduce intermittent contact. So by wearing a face mask, you're not reducing the contact that can come into play on building a wall or jostling for position in the box on a corner kick, and of course, going up for a header. So responsibility when it comes to player facial coverings. Going to and leaving the field, it's the parent. The parent is responsible to make sure that their child is properly equipped with PPE and that they have their face covering on when going to the field and going to the sideline, and then at the end of the game, getting their equipment and leaving. That's the parent's responsibility. The second the player arrives at the field, whether it's a practice or a game, on the sidelines and on the field, it's the coach's responsibility to make sure that the face mask is properly used and is available. And the coach will know each player and identify when they can and cannot have it covering them if they deem it to start being dangerous due to heavy breathing. Neither of these is the responsibility of the referee. The referee is not going to be the face mask police. That is the responsibility of the coaches. The referees aren't to advise players on the use of a face covering during the run of play. They're not to tell a player, you must put your mask on, because the referee may not be aware that that player either has a respiratory challenge, is winded, is involved in high aerobic activity. That's not the referee's call. Okay? If they have an issue or if they have concerns, they should provide comments in their official report, but they're not to admonish, nor to direct, nor to advise players on how to use a face covering. Referees must maintain 6 feet distance at all times during the game and never handle the ball. With the modifications we have, there is no reason for a referee to touch a soccer ball for the entire match. Let's move on into some other important considerations now that we've gone through the modifications, the gathering numbers, and face masks. If need be, to accommodate spectators, we use areas around the field, not just the spectator side. So if you can, and you can't fit everybody in, you can put them around the goal areas, 8 feet back from goal lines. Preferably nobody behind the nets. Make sure that if you do permit seating around areas other than the spectator side, that it is communicated to coaches of both sides, parents, and referees. When it says parents, it really should say spectators, which can be parents, legal guardians, or chaperones. It's also necessary to mark spectator seating at least 8 feet from field boundaries. Reason being is that if there's an AR, they'll need at least 2 feet of space and then the 6-foot buffer. If there's a kick-in, the player will need at least 2 feet of space and then the 6-foot buffer. Scheduling games, we went through this in the last webinar, but as much as possible, keep the groups as small as possible so there's not a lot of spreading out of one team playing 7 other teams or 6 other teams. Keep it as small as possible. Limit travel. But this is all to limit spread and facilitate tracing if needed. So do what you can given what you have to work with. Another consideration to take into play, and this is something different and it's being done in a lot of other states, is team placement during the games. Consider creative alternatives. This one takes teams placed on opposite sides of the field. This is a practice being used in New Jersey. And so it's kind of like the football setup, where you have a team on one side of the field and the team on the other side of the field. They're all separated by 6 feet. And then after the team separation stops, the spectator separation picks up. And each team's spectators are also placed on the same side. So what this does, it keeps people from communities separate at the field other than the players on the field. And the key to this is the adults, is keeping the adults from one community on one side, the other on the other side. And something to consider when you're setting up your fields, if you would like to use this method, and that the referees will need to be notified. And we're going to be talking with our friends at the referee community that this is another modification that has been received very well around the country. Coaches have always been responsible for the actions of their players, parents, and spectators. This does not change. So assign a team COVID coordinator to help out, but the coach is still responsible for their players, parents, and spectators. And once again, attendance must be kept for all activities. The best form of attendance is the roster, and make sure that when the referee shows up, that you get the referee's full name to put down on the roster. And just a quick reminder, I think everybody is doing this, is to use the waiver template language found on the Member Toolkit website page under the Administration tab for your player registrations. It contains the communicable disease and COVID-19 waiver language. Again, PPE, face coverings and masks are the basics, and the masks for players playing have to be the ear loop masks, not the tie around the head or neck gaiters. Have plenty of sanitizer available and disinfectant wipes to wipe down any surfaces. Wearing of gloves is optional, and the key is, if you are going to wear gloves as an adult, is that after you've used the gloves for whatever the purpose is, you properly take them off and dispose of them. And once again, this information's on the Master Soccer website on our Return to Soccer Activities webpage, is to promote the Gloucester Bio hand sanitizer. We have had a large number of organizations take advantage of this. I don't think you'll find any better pricing for the spray that they have, and we're getting a lot of favorable feedback on their product. I'm going to touch on this again. I'm not going to go through a bunch of slides like I did on the last webinar, but I want to focus that the coach is the key. Having all of our member organizations follow the guidelines as provided is paramount, is priority, is of utmost importance. We can't deviate from the guidelines. In the event something ever were to happen down the road, the question will be asked, at the field, at the practice, at the game, did the coach apply and follow the guidelines? The coach is the key to make sure that the guidelines are kept to, set an example for the players, and by doing so, we can really feel rest assured that we are mitigating risk and we are protecting ourselves in the event something were to happen. The second we deviate from the guidelines, whether ours or the state, where we try to find a shortcut, that's when the problems start. And we don't need the problems, and we know we have got incredible coaches throughout the state who take this very seriously and fully understand that the guidelines are there to protect everybody, including themselves. Now, we understand, again, we're going to repeat from the last time, that there are a broad spectrum of risks that our members represent. If a parent or player, guardian says, listen, I do not want my child to participate, respect this decision. No judging, retaliation, adverse actions, or the such. We're aware that we have some member organizations that have decided not to provide soccer activities this fall, and that's their choice. And as a member organization, we're not judging. There will be no retaliation or adverse actions. We respect their decision. And we have to do the same for all parents. We are continuously assessing the current environment. We're looking at the various factors that are taking not only here in Massachusetts, but also in all areas around the state. Mass Youth Soccer will decide to reverse course if we feel it's necessary for the safety of all involved. This could be done prior to the state taking any such actions. We shared this several weeks ago, and we're going to repeat it. Our children, our adults, our members mean the world to us. Your health, your safety, your well-being is more important to us than any other factor that comes into play. And we will do everything we can to make sure that we mitigate risk and protect our members. In order to help us do that, we've got our Return to Soccer Activities webpage constantly kept up to date with more information. Please use it as your primary resource. It's required that we follow the guidelines as provided by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Required. It's not an option. Help us by identifying your COVID safety officer and your COVID coordinator. We did provide some information for the COVID safety officer at the last webinar, and I think at this point, the information that we have up on our website, there's slides about the role, up to date. We are not taking into consideration any other factors that may come into play. Apologize for the ringing coming in. All coaches and spectators and volunteers and employees must read, understand, and practice the Mass Youth Soccer guideline requirements. And folks, this is a group effort that requires a collective focus. All of us working together will do what's right. I do want to summarize, before I do, is to also just note that we are selling the t-shirts and the patches that were designed by our members It's on our website under, I believe, programs or events, but it's the tribute to essential workers. And the weekend of the 17th to the 20th, that 4-day period, 3-day period, will be when we plan to celebrate everybody that's been protecting us. And all of the proceeds from the t-shirts and the patches go to Project Bread. So I thank you for watching this. And in closing, I would like to just emphasize that we are making these modifications based on what the state has told us to do with the last update and guidance that came out. Do you really think that we want to alter the game or reimagine the game, redefine the laws of the game? No, we don't. We love the game that we play. We respect the laws of the game. And it is just absolutely a beautiful game all the way through. But in order for us to be able to provide our children with the safest and healthiest environment to play, under guidance from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we had to make modifications. And I'm going to circle all the way back to how we started this. We have to make modifications to go to restaurants. We have to make modifications to go shopping. We have to make modifications for gathering. Soccer and a youth sport is no different. We have to make modifications because it's either modify or not play. And that's an easy decision. Modify. The kids get it. They'll adapt. They'll find it to be fun. And we're there to support them. I'd like to thank everybody for what you do to make our children enjoy the game of soccer in the safest and healthiest environment possible. Thank you.